This is Mary. Welcome to the IHC Craft Room.
In today's video, I'm going to show you how I made this heart-shaped dot painted rock just in time for Valentine's Day. Grab all your stuff and let's get crafty.
For materials, we're going to begin with a 4-inch heart stone, some acrylic paint in pink, gray, white, and black. I'm going to be using a matte varnish for my base coat protection and then a gloss varnish to cover the entire project. For tools today, of course, we'll be using our dotting tools, paint pods or a palette, a stencil or you can use a compass, a paintbrush, toothpicks, and Q-tips. I'm going to start with a couple of thin coats of black paint as the base coat. You'll notice that I don't paint the bottom of my rocks at the beginning, and I'll explain why a little later. Followed by a thin coat of varnish. This is to protect the base coat so that if I make a mistake, the Q-tip doesn't strip my base. I'm going to be using some guidelines on this project, so I'm going to start with a small circle on the left-hand side, followed by 2 arcs on the right side. I struggled a little bit with these stencils, and in retrospect, it would have been easier to just use a compass here, but as usual, I made it work. Take a deep breath, let it out, and place your center dot using the 10.0 rod and pink paint. You'll notice that the dot is not perfectly centered in the circle. I could have erased the circle and redrawn it, or I could have erased the dot and placed it again. But I decided to leave it. Why? Because that's hand painted, baby. If you want it perfect, get a machine to do it. But if you want one of a kind, then embrace the handmade imperfections. Okay, now let's focus on this circle. We're going to be using a 3mm green stylus and pink paint, and we're going to be dropping these dots all the way around the circle. But you'll notice that I'm leaving a noticeable gap between each dot. Don't worry, we're going to be filling in that space. You'll also notice that I am repeatedly stopping throughout this process to pop bubbles in my paint. This is incredibly important, and I can't stress this enough. Never leave a bubble unpopped, because if you don't pop it, time will pop it for you and leave it in your finished product. And that is no bueno, mi amigos. Using the blue 1mm stylus and some gray paint, let's drop some little baby dots all around the center dot and give it a nice trim. You're going to notice that I don't complete this circle, and that's because I don't want to mess it up. So here's a quick tip. Wait for it to dry and then go back and drop that last dot. Trust me, this works. Now that the trim is dry, let's go ahead and put in that last dot before we start the next row. For our next row, we're going to use gray paint and our 2.0 pink stylus. And I'm just focusing on getting my dots as close as possible without touching. Take your time. I often focus on breathing out when I place a dot. That keeps my hand steady and helps me focus on the spot where I want the dot to land. I'm going to slow this down a little bit because I want to draw attention to the fact that I chose not to move that center dot and now it's impacting my design. I have 2 options here. I can dot using this tool and overlap the pink row, which is not my preference, or I can do what I did do, which is adjust the size of my dots to fit the space available to me. I did dot this row using a 2.5 white stylus and some dark gray paint, and I just made that dark gray by adding some black to my gray. Now let's get started on this first arc. We're going to use the same dotting tool, which is the 2.5 white stylus, and the same dark gray paint to drop some dots along the line, making sure once again to leave enough space that your dots aren't touching. If you're a beginner dot painter, you know that keeping your dots separated is not as easy as it looks, and the only way to get better at it is to just keep doing it. Repetition is the key. I know it's frustrating, but eventually you'll get to the point where it's second nature. Let's move on to the second arc. I'm going to be using pink paint and the 4.5 rod tool. A little warning about dotting over the edge of the rock. If your paint is runny, well, she's going to warp your dot. So keep that in mind. If you're going to dot over the edge, maybe keep the rock in that position and let the paint dry a little bit before laying the rock flat again. It seems to me that another arc is in order here, and I want to bring that dark gray back, so I'm going to be using my number 6.0 rod and dark gray paint to finish off the edge of this rock. Okay, now it's time to hit the spaces with some gray. Using that 3mm green stylus, and again, you'll notice I'm adjusting the size of my dots to the space available to me. Let's do that again in the gap that remains between the last 2 arcs. And you're going to see that there are some tight spots here. So we're going to have to make it work, but don't worry. That's the beauty of dot painting. We can adjust. I let the paint dry, and now I'm going to start erasing my guidelines so that I can focus on filling in the gaps that I want to fill. I started off with an eraser, and then I quickly remembered I didn't use a regular pencil for my guidelines. I used a chalk pencil. So then I started using a damp Q-tip to clean off guidelines. Let's start filling in those gaps as I promised we would. We're going to use the smallest stylus we have, which is the 0.8 millimeter yellow stylus, and some white paint. It's important not to put too much paint on your dotting tool here. The more paint you add to your dotting tool, the bigger your dot will be. And we want the teeniest, tiniest dots you ever did see. You'll notice that I'm periodically cleaning off my dotting tool. That's because even if you're careful about how much paint you load onto your stylus, it will slowly build up as the paint itself starts to dry on the dotting tool. So that will of course increase the size of the dot. And again, we're going for micro dots here, so that's no bueno. So when you start to notice paint build up on your stylus, wipe it clean and then load it with a bit more paint. I'm just going to continue doing the same thing across all of these different arcs that we painted previously and just go in between each of the dots and drop a couple of micro dots in between. You know, I just realized I never explained why I don't paint the bottom of my rocks until the project is complete. Cliffhanger, eh? Anywho, if space allows, I might use a bigger dot and move on to the 1 millimeter stylus, or flip over the stylus I have right now in my hand, which would give me a 1.25 millimeter dot to work with in filling those little gaps and really completing the look of these arcs. And with that, we've completed the foundation of our pattern, and really we could stop here. But to me, a design is never complete without top dots. They really highlight and bring out the beauty of dot painting designs, in my opinion, and bring another dimension to the piece. The center top dot is using the 5.0 rod tool and a light pink paint that I made by adding white to the pink. I've done the same to the gray paint and will be using the 1 millimeter blue stylus to add these light gray top dots. To give some nice contrast, I'm going to be using black to top dot the dark gray dots, and I'll stick with that same 1 millimeter blue stylus to do that. It seems like no matter how hard I try, every time I record myself dot painting, I end up missing a section. RIP lost footage. Let's not dwell. Moving on. Okay, let's keep it moving. I'm continuing the top dots in black here over the dark gray dots. And this time I'm using the flip side of a stylus to get a 1.25 millimeter dot. I'm going to do the same thing with the light gray dots. But for the light pink dots, we'll bump the size up a bit and use the 3 millimeter green stylus instead. While I top dot these gray dots, let me explain why I don't paint the base of my rocks until the end. It's simple. I move my rocks around so much that I end up scraping the bottom so badly that it's a total waste of time. All right, we're now in the home stretch. Last round of top dots. For the dark gray, we're going to be using black again and the 4.0 rod. Turns out that while I've been doing all this top dotting, my center dot has dried with a peak at the center. Had I noticed it when the paint was wet, I would have smoothed it out with my stylus. But since I didn't, that poses a bit of a problem. I could leave it with a peak, but that's not my personal preference, so I decided to try to smooth it out a touch and then add an additional top dot to cover up the wreckage. And I'm so very glad that I did. I think it not only fixed the problem, but actually adding that white little dot really added a little extra something. What do you think? Do you think this heart turned out as pretty as I do? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for joining me on this black, gray, pink, and white dotted heart adventure. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please subscribe to my channel and comment below so that we can continue to get crafty together. Toodaloo!